Maria Flowers had always lived life with a quiet sense of order. She wasn't one for drama or disruption, and most of her energy was reserved for her son, Lucas. A single mother by circumstance rather than choice, Maria had spent the last 10 years building a stable life for her and her boy. One made up of early mornings, spreadsheets, packed lunches, and the measured cadence of adult responsibility. She worked in internal compliance for a regional transportation company, a job not exactly thrilling, but one that brought structure and peace of mind. Her world revolved around balancing risk, preventing small issues from becoming big ones, and maintaining a quiet sense of control in systems that most people never thought about. That mindset extended far beyond her job and into how she handled parenting. Lucas, her 10-year-old, had cerebral palsy and used a motorized wheelchair for mobility. He was a bright, gentle child, observant, curious, a little shy, with a deep fascination for nature and an encyclopedic memory for birds. He could recite Latin species names the way some kids quoted superhero stats, and though his movement was limited, his imagination was boundless. Saturdays were sacred. That was their time. Not for errands or chores, but for something quieter and more intentional. This particular Saturday had been circled on Maria's calendar for weeks. The forecast promised clear skies and a breeze just cool enough to make the air feel alive. She'd planned a trip to Magnolia Park, a lakeside reserve on the edge of the town with wide, paved paths, a dedicated accessibility loop, and dozens of shaded spots for observation. It wasn't far from the city, but the way the trees swallowed the sound of traffic made it feel like another world. Lucas had been especially excited. He'd been working on a handmade guidebook for his class, tracking native bird species and sketching them with colored pencils sharpened down to stubs. This wasn't just recreation. It was important to him. A small dream in motion. A project he could call his own. They arrived mid-morning, just as the sun began to edge above the tallest oaks, casting soft light across the grass. Maria parked in the designated spot near the east entrance, helping Lucas unload his gear with the quiet efficiency of habit. His wheelchair was newer, one of the better models, partially funded through a grant she'd fought hard to secure the year prior. It responded well to his slight movements, gliding over uneven ground with minimal resistance. Maria walked beside him as they made their way down a gentle slope toward the lake, the gravel path giving way to smooth concrete. Lucas wore a khaki sun hat with a built-in neck flap and carried a small field notebook in his lap. His excitement was visible in the way his eyes scanned the trees, listening for chirps and whistles. They picked a spot near the water, secluded but not isolated, where they could observe without obstruction. Maria set down their cooler and unfolded a compact chair for herself. She sipped from her thermos while Lucas leaned slightly forward in his chair, pointing with quiet awe toward a blue heron that had just touched down near the opposite bank. The moment was simple. It was perfect. For a while, they said very little, communicating through shared glances and the occasional scribble in Lucas's notebook. Maria allowed herself to exhale in that rare way she only did when nothing needed managing. It was peace, rare and real. The first sign of disruption came not with noise, but with energy. Maria felt it before she heard it. The kind of shifting atmosphere that precedes a confrontation, a break in rhythm, the sensation of someone else's chaos entering your carefully constructed calm. A family was approaching from the main path. They were loud, in the way that made you pay attention even if you didn't want to. A woman led the group, impeccably dressed for the park in a crisp white sun visor, floral blouse, and high-end sandals that looked like they'd never seen dirt. Behind her trailed a mix of relatives. 2 adult men carrying folding chairs and coolers, a teenage girl on her phone, and 2 younger children chasing each other with reckless abandon. Maria watched from the corner of her eye as the group veered toward the lake's edge, eyeing the same shaded alcove Maria and Lucas occupied. The woman gave Maria a tight, polite smile, the kind that said she noticed her but didn't particularly want to acknowledge her presence. She spoke loudly enough for her group to hear, though her eyes remained fixed on the space just beside where Lucas was stationed. "This area would be just perfect," she said, ignoring the fact that it was already occupied. "Nice and breezy. The kids will love it." Maria sat up slightly. "We're already settled here," she said, calm but direct. "There's another shaded bench just a little further down." The woman's eyes flicked to Lucas and then back to Maria, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I didn't realize this was reserved," she replied with saccharine sweetness. "We're just looking for somewhere with enough space for the whole family, you understand. We have medical needs, too." She motioned vaguely to one of the boys who immediately whined for a snack. There was no indication of any specific need. Maria resisted the urge to respond sharply. She simply shook her head. "There's space over there," she repeated. For a brief moment it seemed the woman might insist, but instead she pivoted, directing her family elsewhere with the exaggerated patience of someone who wanted to be seen as the bigger person. "Let's not make a thing out of it," she said loudly, though no one had suggested making anything out of it at all. Maria let out a slow breath. She turned her attention back to Lucas, who had stopped writing and was watching the scene quietly. She smiled at him, reached over, and smoothed a wrinkle in his shirt. "We're good," she whispered. But they weren't. The mood had shifted. Something had been introduced into their day that wasn't going to leave easily. The woman, Karen, as Maria would later learn, had taken personal offense to being challenged, even gently, and the seed of resentment had been planted. Over the next half hour, Maria noticed the family nearby glancing their way more than once, whispering. The kids were playing closer than necessary, skimming past Lucas's chair as if to test invisible boundaries. Maria tried to shake it off, to not let the paranoia take root, but instincts were instincts for a reason. It happened quickly. One of the younger boys, a blond child with sticky fingers and untied shoes, darted too close to Lucas's chair and tripped over a root. He fell to the ground with a shriek that rang louder than the moment warranted. Before Maria could even react, the woman came storming over, voice raised. "I asked you nicely," Karen said, although she hadn't. "This is not a safe spot for kids to be running around with machines taking up all the space. My son could have been seriously hurt." Maria stood up. "Your son was running unsupervised. My child is sitting where he's allowed to sit." Karen's eyes narrowed, and then, without asking, she reached out and grabbed the back of Lucas's wheelchair, turning it slightly as if to inspect it, or worse, to move it. Lucas flinched hard. "Don't touch him," Maria shouted, louder than she expected. She stepped between them, her voice firm. "Step back, now." Karen recoiled like she'd been insulted. "Excuse me? Don't you raise your voice at me. I'm trying to prevent an accident. You're making a scene." "You just touched my child's medical equipment without consent," Maria snapped. "That's not prevention, that's assault." By then, others in the park had turned to look. Karen's family approached from behind, some curious, others posturing. One of the men, tall with mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward as if to calm things down, but it felt more like intimidation. Karen's voice shifted from indignation to victimhood in seconds. "She just went off on me out of nowhere," she said, eyes wide, hand to chest. "I was just checking on my son, and she started screaming. In front of the children." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Lucas sat frozen in his chair, eyes locked onto her with wordless panic. She didn't raise her voice again. Instead, she reached for her phone and calmly said, "I'm calling emergency services. You just put your hands on my son. He has a condition. He could have been seriously hurt." Karen's expression flickered, some mix of fear and fury, before settling into something colder. She stepped back, folded her arms, and said nothing more. The others didn't speak either, though their silence felt like complicity. Maria stood there, phone in hand, shielding her son with her body. The peaceful morning shattered into 1,000 sharp edges. And the day was only beginning. The moment Maria ended the call, a strange silence settled over the lakeside trail. Not peaceful, not calming, but the kind of silence that follows a loud noise, charged with leftover tension and the heavy presence of too many people who had just witnessed something and weren't sure what to do about it. Maria's hands trembled slightly, though she kept them low, out of Lucas's sight. She didn't want him to feel more unsettled than he already was. His wheelchair hadn't been damaged, at least not visibly, but the emotional blow lingered. His eyes hadn't left her face, silently asking a question he didn't know how to put into words. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered something neutral, something like, "Everything's okay," though they both knew it wasn't. Karen and her family had retreated a few feet but hadn't left the area, remaining close enough to listen and close enough to look like part of the situation without having to take any responsibility for it. When the first patrol car pulled into the park's edge about 12 minutes later, Maria was still standing guard near her son, body tense but calm. The responding officer, a man in his late 30s with a disarming smile and efficient stride, approached with a practiced neutrality that Maria found both reassuring and vaguely threatening. She greeted him respectfully, introducing herself by name and immediately explaining the nature of the incident. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just stated the facts. A stranger had physically interfered with her son's medically essential wheelchair, without consent, during what had been a calm and lawful visit to a public park. She emphasized that her son had a diagnosed condition and that the wheelchair was not a toy or a seat. It was an extension of his autonomy. The officer nodded, took notes, and then turned to speak to Karen, who had already adopted the role of the misunderstood victim with disturbing ease. From where Maria stood, she could hear the high, quivering notes of Karen's voice as she detailed her version of events. How the child in the wheelchair had been parked too close to where the children were playing. How she'd simply tried to ensure everyone's safety. How the other woman had overreacted and began shouting in front of minors. She even used the word hostile. Maria could almost see the narrative forming, and it made her stomach twist. It wasn't just the lie itself. It was how confidently it was being told. How skillfully Karen layered half-truths into something that sounded just close enough to plausible that someone might hesitate to challenge it. The officer returned to Maria after several minutes and politely asked if there had been any injuries or visible damage to the equipment. She answered that while no visible harm was done, her son was in emotional distress and that she herself had been shoved, lightly but intentionally, when trying to stop the interference. She also mentioned that she was seeking medical attention later to ensure no damage had been done to her shoulder. That added a note of formality that slightly changed the officer's tone. He began documenting more carefully, asking for names, dates, background. Maria provided everything, including her professional ID, which identified her as a state compliance analyst. That seemed to shift something, perhaps not in her favor, but at least toward neutrality. She didn't need special treatment. She just needed accuracy. Eventually, the officer informed her that because there were conflicting statements and no clear injuries at the scene, a formal report would be filed but no one would be cited or detained at the moment. That didn't surprise Maria. She knew how these things worked. In the absence of dramatic evidence or physical harm, most public disputes were treated like schoolyard squabbles. Note it down, move along. Still, she insisted on receiving the incident number and requested that her son's name be listed in the report as a minor involved in a physical interaction. She wanted it in writing, and she wanted it now. Karen and her family began packing up soon after. As they left, Karen cast one last glance over her shoulder, and it wasn't angry or apologetic. It was calculating. That expression, more than anything, unnerved Maria. It was the look of someone who hadn't lost, just recalibrated. The next day, Maria stayed home from work. Her shoulder ached more than she'd expected, and though it wasn't debilitating, it gave her a valid reason to step back and process what had happened. Lucas didn't bring up the park. He spent most of the day sketching in his room, unusually quiet, occasionally pausing to stare at nothing. Maria recognized the signs. His nervous system took longer to calm down after disruptions, and though he was too kind to blame anyone, she knew he was reliving it in his own way. She booked a session with his child psychologist not because of panic, but because she believed in being proactive. She also took the afternoon to visit an urgent care facility where they confirmed a mild sprain and gave her a treatment protocol: ice, rest, anti-inflammatories. The nurse asked her what had happened, and when Maria explained, the woman simply frowned and muttered, "People think they can do anything these days." Later that evening, Maria checked her email and found a message from the park's administrative office. Someone, clearly Karen, had filed a community incident concern, alleging that Maria had caused a public disturbance and frightened children in a shared space. The email was vague, citing that an investigative review was underway and that Maria would be contacted if further information was required. It wasn't disciplinary, it wasn't even official, but it was enough to leave a pit in her stomach. She forwarded the message to a colleague from work, a legal advisor in her department, and asked cautiously for advice. He replied quickly, telling her not to respond directly, not to escalate, and to keep documentation of everything: timestamps, witness names, medical reports. "These things are rarely about what actually happened," he wrote. "They're about what can be proven." Over the next 48 hours, Maria went about her life with mechanical precision. She drove Lucas to therapy, updated her supervisor on her injury, submitted her time-off request, and documented her version of events in writing while it was still fresh. What she didn't expect, however, was what came next. On Wednesday morning, she received a certified letter. It had no return address, just a tracking barcode and a seal from the city's Parks and Recreation Department. Inside was a formal notice. Maria was being placed on temporary suspension from all public events held on municipal park property, pending a resolution of the aforementioned incident. The justification? Escalatory conduct and disruptive behavior. The letter included language about upholding the safety and enjoyment of all patrons, and referenced the need for further review of participant eligibility for inclusive community access. The phrasing was so abstract that Maria had to read it twice just to understand that she was in effect being banned. She sat at her kitchen table staring at the letter as if it had arrived in another language. Lucas was at school. The house was quiet. Her coffee had gone cold, and for the first time since the incident, Maria felt genuinely afraid, not because of what had happened, but because of what might. Because it was suddenly clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a move, a calculated, deliberate action meant to undermine her credibility and discredit her position before she could even defend it. And she had no idea how far it would go. Maria hadn't expected the letter to feel as personal as it did. It was, on the surface, a piece of bureaucratic paper filled with impersonal language and generic phrases about community safety and administrative review. But something in its sterile phrasing made her feel like a name on a list, like someone being quietly shuffled out the back door while others politely looked the other way. She placed the notice in a folder and labeled it with a date. That small act, filing it away methodically, precisely, brought her a sliver of stability, the kind she relied on when things stopped making sense. The next step was not to react emotionally, though she wanted to. The next step was to gather clarity, and that started with understanding the scope of the accusations against her. She contacted the Parks and Recreation Department and requested all documentation associated with her suspension. The woman on the other end of the phone was polite but distant, telling Maria she would need to submit a formal request in writing and that the process could take up to 14 business days. Maria thanked her and immediately drafted the email, attaching it to a notarized identity verification document she kept for legal use. She didn't intend to wait 2 weeks. She just needed the clock to start ticking. The next shift happened quietly. At first, Maria assumed it was her own perception playing tricks on her. Colleagues at work seemed a bit more reserved, especially one woman from payroll who had always been friendly and chatty. Conversations stopped when she entered break rooms. Emails from a parent-teacher group she subscribed to no longer included her in planning threads. These weren't overt attacks. These were the kind of passive social withdrawals that occur when people don't know what's true and what isn't, and would rather err on the side of caution. Maria knew that instinct all too well. It was the same impulse that kept compliance departments from questioning irregularities in contracts or digging too deeply into internal errors unless absolutely necessary. The cultural reflex to remain neutral until someone else decided who was in the wrong was as old as bureaucracy itself. Still, the isolation stung. Then, on a Monday afternoon, she received a call from the school principal. It was phrased delicately, how everything was, but the message was clear. They had received a community concern about an altercation involving Maria and her child, and while the school had not been given specific details, they wanted to be transparent and let her know that some parents had expressed discomfort about recent events. Maria asked calmly if any of those parents had names. The principal deflected. She asked if Lucas's access to school programs was in question. The principal said, not at this time. But it was clear. Things were being quietly questioned behind her back. She thanked the principal for the call, hung up, and just sat there, frozen. It wasn't about a park anymore. It was now leaking into the one place where her son had always felt safe. She decided to visit the school the next morning, not to argue, not to plead, just to be present. She sat outside Lucas's classroom for a while after drop-off, under the pretense of reading her emails. She saw Karen. Not directly. Karen didn't enter the building, but she saw her across the parking lot leaning against a car, talking to another parent. The woman she spoke to glanced in Maria's direction, then quickly looked away. Maria recognized that look. She'd seen it before in staff meetings when people realized there was a political problem on the table and nobody wanted their fingerprints on it. That night, Lucas asked if they were still going to visit the park again. He said it with hesitation, clearly remembering the previous incident but trying to separate it from the place he still loved. Maria smiled and said they'd go somewhere else for now, but she promised it would be just as good. She lied. There was nowhere else quite like Magnolia Park. Later that week, Maria received an email from her workplace's HR department. It was marked confidential and requested a brief meeting to discuss a community-related incident that had been brought to their attention. She knew what it was about. It wasn't about her work. It wasn't even about her behavior. It was about perception, about the image of a person involved in something people didn't want to understand. During the meeting, she was asked if she felt the issue could interfere with her professional performance. She said no, and she meant it. She was then asked if she would consider taking personal time to let things settle. That she understood as a warning. She declined, respectfully, but with a firmness that made the HR representative blink. She was being pushed, not hard, not with malice, just steadily enough to feel it under her ribs. That night she emailed the legal advisor she'd spoken to earlier, asking if he could refer her to someone who specialized in reputational defense. Not a defamation attorney. Not yet. Just someone who could quietly assess the risks. Someone who understood how soft power was used to make problems disappear. He sent back 3 names. Maria didn't call any of them. Not yet, but she wrote them down on a pad near her bed. The next morning, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, a stack of printed flyers, each with a copy of a screenshot from a neighborhood message board thread. The headline read, "Aggressive Woman. Causes seen at Magnolia Park. Be alert." The text underneath included a vague, dramatic retelling of the incident, ending with a warning to parents to be cautious around her. Her name was in bold. It had been shared over 200 times. Her address was in one of the comments, blurred in the copy but visible enough to know someone had posted it. She stared at the stack, her mouth dry, then folded it back up and slid it into a drawer. She didn't know who had sent it. The mail carrier said it was dropped off by a private courier. Maria knew the window was closing. What had started as a single event was now being maneuvered into something else. A narrative where she was being quietly cast as unstable, confrontational, unsafe. And it was working, because she wasn't fighting back in the way people expected. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't recording videos. She was documenting, calling, archiving, but it wasn't visible, and so it looked like silence, looked like concession. She made a new appointment with her own supervisor and laid everything out, not emotionally, but with clarity. She showed the certified letter, the email from the school, the HR meeting summary, and the anonymous flyer. Her supervisor listened carefully and didn't interrupt once. When Maria finished, he leaned back and said, "You need to get ahead of this now." He wasn't unsympathetic. He was being pragmatic. Don't wait for it to grow teeth. That night, Maria drafted a formal complaint to the city ombudsman's office. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but a clearly structured request for investigation into improper use of municipal systems, including the possible misuse of influence by community members to suppress access and distort records. She included her son's status as a protected minor with mobility needs, and she requested that her temporary suspension be lifted pending review. She included documents, receipts, reports, a statement from the medical center about her injury, and she made a list of every person who had said something, every organization that had taken action, every interaction that had shifted since the incident. She wasn't trying to ruin anyone. She was trying to stop something from being quietly weaponized against her and her child. Because it was already happening, and she wasn't going to let it spread unchecked. It was only after the email was sent that Maria finally exhaled. It wasn't over, but now it was moving, and movement for the first time in days felt like power. In the week that followed, Maria operated with the careful deliberation of someone who sensed that the air around her had changed but hadn't yet figured out how. Since submitting her formal complaint to the city ombudsman, there had been no immediate reply, but she knew enough about how systems moved to recognize the quiet momentum of a process beginning to unfold. It didn't comfort her, but it steadied her. Every day she held herself with composure, at work, at school drop-offs, at the grocery store, but the internal calculus never stopped. What would be the next move? What would Karen do? Or worse, what would someone connected to her try to do behind closed doors, where policies were written in quiet and alliances rarely announced themselves? Then the letter came. A formal acknowledgement from the ombudsman's office confirming receipt of Maria's complaint and noting that preliminary findings had revealed an unusual pattern of citizen-submitted reports over the past 18 months, many of which had been filed by the same cluster of individuals, including one Karen Beckett. The tone was measured, professional, but the subtext was undeniable. This wasn't just about Maria anymore. This was a pattern. And Maria's story had entered it like a pin sliding into a map already crowded with other invisible battles. She printed the letter and read it aloud to Lucas that evening, not because he needed to understand the legal nuances, but because she believed in showing him that action, even quiet, unglamorous action, could lead somewhere. Lucas listened, eyes fixed on her face, then asked softly if he could still finish his bird project even if they weren't allowed to go back to that park. Maria told him yes, of course he could, and the next day she took time off work to bring him to the city archives where they pored over old wildlife catalogs and local birding maps. He worked quietly, his pencil gliding over the paper, and she watched him with a mix of admiration and heartbreak. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was trying to regain control over something small but sacred. His curiosity, his purpose. She would not let that be taken too. The real shift came on a Tuesday morning. A man from the Department of Civic Policy called her directly. He introduced himself with a calm, clipped voice and asked if she'd be willing to attend a confidential meeting to discuss the broader implications of recent community incidents. The phrasing was vague enough to be meaningless, but she agreed. She knew a test when she saw one. The meeting took place in a windowless city building, where she was led to a small conference room and seated at a rounded table across from 3 people: a compliance officer from the Parks Department, a city legal liaison, and a woman from the Office of Disability Equity. No one was hostile. No one was warm. They were there to listen, to assess. Maria spoke plainly. She didn't accuse, she described. She laid out the timeline, the documentation, the consequences to her son's routine, and the creeping erosion of their public dignity. She referenced the flyers, the anonymous postings, the whispers at her son's school. She didn't dramatize any of it. She didn't have to. The most surprising moment came when the woman from Disability Equity leaned forward and asked, "Are you familiar with the name Karen Beckett?" Maria didn't answer immediately. The silence hung just long enough for the question's weight to settle, and then she nodded. Yes, she was familiar. The man on the left, Parks Compliance, cleared his throat and confirmed that Ms. Beckett had been involved in multiple public complaints over the last 2 years, each centered around other parents, mostly women, most of them with children requiring some form of accommodation. None of the reports had led to formal actions, but they had created a consistent pattern of discomfort. Weaponized discomfort, Maria thought, the phrase appearing in her mind with such clarity it almost startled her. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside and felt the wind on her face like it belonged to another season entirely. Something had changed. She wasn't just defending herself now. She had stepped into a much larger conversation, one that had already begun without her and one that, in some way, needed her presence to move forward. But whatever momentary relief she felt evaporated that same evening. Her phone rang. It was Lucas's teacher, apologetic but urgent. She informed Maria that Karen had been invited to speak at the upcoming PTA meeting, introduced as a concerned parent, advocating for community well-being. Maria didn't shout or protest. She thanked the teacher, hung up, and sat in silence. Karen wasn't backing off. She was embedding herself, cloaking her influence in public service language. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Maria could see it clearly. This was how reputations were dismantled not by violence or defamation, but by quiet replacement. Karen was trying to replace her version of the story, her credibility, her place in the community. So Maria made a decision. She didn't write an angry letter or stage a confrontation. She simply showed up. The PTA meeting was held in a modest auditorium filled with folding chairs and that faint smell of old carpet and stale coffee. Karen was already speaking when Maria walked in. She stood at the front with prepared handouts about emotional safety and conflict avoidance in public spaces. Her words were smooth, the kind that didn't name names but didn't need to. "We must be vigilant," she said, "about how we teach our children to handle aggression, especially from adults who may not have the emotional tools to de-escalate tension." Maria didn't flinch. She sat in the back row, watched, waited. When the floor opened for comments, she stood, not with defiance but with calm clarity. "I'm Maria Flowers," she said. "My son attends this school. Many of you know him. Some of you know me. We've always believed in being part of this community, not as guests, but as equals. I believe in emotional safety, too. I also believe in fairness, in not mistaking discomfort for danger. My son has the right to be in public without apology. So do I. That's all I wanted to say." She sat down. No applause followed, but no one interrupted her. No one scoffed. The room was quiet, not in judgment, but in recalibration. After the meeting, 2 mothers she didn't know well approached her. One of them said, "I didn't know what to think before, but now I do. Thank you." Maria walked out into the night, not triumphant but grounded. She hadn't won. There was nothing to win. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was reacting to someone else's moves. She had made her own. And in that stillness, in that refusal to be erased quietly, she had regained something greater than control. She had restored her place. It had been just over 2 weeks since the PTA meeting when Maria began to notice the second shift. Not dramatic, not announced, but systemic in its breadth and unmistakable in its intention. The first sign came on a Thursday afternoon when she received an email from the Parks Department. This time, not from a community liaison or a clerk, but directly from their general counsel. The subject line was concise: Notice of Liability Review. The language inside the letter was courteous but unmistakably strategic. It informed her that due to the growing number of interactions between herself and municipal personnel, and concerns expressed by members of the public, her previously filed complaints, incident reports, and communication records would be included in a comprehensive departmental review to determine if any policies had been violated by anyone, including her. Maria read the email twice, then a third time. There was no mention of specific wrongdoing, but that wasn't the point. The point was pressure. This was not about what had happened in the park anymore. This was about positioning her as a destabilizing element, someone whose presence triggered administrative headaches, someone worth removing quietly for the sake of public order. That same evening, as she drove home from work, she noticed a black SUV idling across the street from her house, just beyond the corner where the sidewalk bent into shadows. It wasn't particularly out of place. She lived in a mixed neighborhood with regular traffic, but something about the car's stillness unsettled her. It was the posture of the vehicle that struck her most. It wasn't waiting. It was watching. The next morning, it was gone. By itself, the car meant nothing. But paired with the letter, it suggested that the escalation wasn't only bureaucratic, it was becoming personal. By Monday, the escalation had bled fully into her son's world. Lucas came home from school with a sealed envelope addressed to the parent or guardian of Lucas Flowers. Inside was a note from the school counselor stating that Lucas had been referred for observation due to emerging social anxiety and withdrawal behaviors. Maria was stunned. No one had contacted her directly. There had been no behavioral reports, no teacher concerns in recent weeks. She immediately called the counselor's office and requested a meeting. What she encountered there confirmed her fears. The referral had been submitted by Karen Beckett. Not as a school official, of course, she held no such title, but as a member of the newly formed Parent Wellness Council, an unofficial advisory group that, according to the principal, supported mental health awareness among students and parents. Karen had flagged Lucas for isolation and signs of emotional distress. Maria barely contained her fury. Her son wasn't a case. He wasn't a cautionary tale. He was a boy recovering from a traumatic event that Karen herself had instigated. Maria demanded to see the documentation. What she read chilled her. The report didn't accuse Lucas of misbehavior, but it subtly framed him as vulnerable, unpredictable, and possibly overwhelmed by parental instability. That phrase stood out like a blade. This wasn't about Lucas at all. It was about discrediting Maria as a mother. That night, after putting Lucas to bed, she sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents. Printouts of emails, medical notes, legal letters, and her growing stack of unanswered questions. She realized, with painful clarity, that the strategy being used against her wasn't just one of smear or pressure. It was fragmentation. They were trying to peel her apart piece by piece, first her right to public space, then her presence in school life, now her credibility as a parent. She contacted an attorney the next day, not the legal advisor from her department, but one of the names she'd written on that notepad weeks earlier. The woman's name was Dana Lowell, a seasoned family rights lawyer known for her work with disenfranchised mothers in municipal disputes. Their first conversation was brief but direct. Dana didn't ask for a blow-by-blow recounting. She asked for files. Maria sent over everything. Within 24 hours, Dana called her back and said, "They're going after your reputation through administrative pathways. It's strategic, and it's not random." That sentence stuck with Maria. Not random. That meant intentional. That meant directed. That meant Karen. Meanwhile, the city's ombudsman had responded with a preliminary note that her complaint had triggered a secondary inquiry into patterns of public complaint filing and their impact on access rights. No promises, no time frames, but the inquiry itself was progress. However, Maria wasn't under any illusion that she could wait for others to rescue her. She needed to act. That weekend, she gathered the few people in her life she trusted completely. Her sister, her former college roommate who now worked in public relations, and one of Lucas's therapists. They sat in her living room, surrounded by folders, and began to map the entire timeline of events. They marked intersections, when complaints were filed, when public access was revoked, when informal roles like parent wellness counsel appeared. What they saw, laid out on paper, was deeply troubling. A consistent pattern of power exerted through informal authority structures, unsanctioned committees, whispered referrals, unverified neighborhood reports, used to pressure mothers, especially those advocating for children with visible or special needs. Lucas's therapist shared that she had seen this before in other districts where mothers were quietly labeled as difficult simply for asking for what their children were legally entitled to receive. By the time the group left, Maria had not only a clearer picture of the system she was confronting, but a new plan. With Dana's help, she filed a formal cease and desist letter directed at Karen Beckett, demanding that she retract her unverified report on Lucas and remove herself from any school-related advisory roles involving the Flowers family. The letter wasn't designed to scare. It was designed to draw a line. It was a marker in the ground, and the reaction came fast. Within 2 days, Dana received a reply from an attorney representing Karen, claiming that her client had only acted in good faith and had a constitutional right to participate in community discussions. The response was slick, almost automated. Dana told Maria, "That's fine. We're not after her feelings. We're building the record." Then came the tipping point. Maria's supervisor called her into his office late Thursday afternoon. He looked exhausted, sympathetic, but guarded. He informed her that an anonymous ethics complaint had been filed against her at work, citing undisclosed personal conflicts potentially impacting professional objectivity. He said the board had no choice but to launch a preliminary review. She wouldn't be suspended, but she would be placed under an internal audit of all her recent work. Maria felt her throat tighten. This was no longer just Karen. This was systemic infection. Someone had crossed the line from social manipulation into her livelihood. Maria didn't cry. She didn't panic. She walked out of that office with her head high, went home, and began preparing for war. Not the kind fought in courtrooms or on social media, but the kind fought in the shadows of policy, reputation, and institutional perception. She wasn't interested in vengeance. She wanted survival, dignity, and, most of all, she wanted safety. For her son, for herself, for every woman who might face this same slow, invisible assault. She opened her laptop, created a folder titled Integrity, and began uploading everything. Every document, every date, every report, every interaction. Then she picked up her phone, stared at Karen's name on the cease and desist copy, and whispered to herself, "You've made this bigger than me. That was your mistake." The morning of the hearing arrived under a thick, colorless sky that seemed to press down on the city like a held breath. Maria stood at the mirror, fastening the last button on her blazer with hands that moved with calm precision, despite the low, electric buzz beneath her skin. She had prepared for this moment with the same methodical attention she applied to her work, her parenting, her legal filings. There would be no tears today, no reactive emotion, no dramatics. This was not a confrontation. It was a presentation of truth, curated through evidence, backed by law, and laced with the quiet, unrelenting urgency of a mother who had refused to be buried under someone else's version of events. The administrative hearing had been scheduled in response to the ethics complaint filed against Maria, an anonymous allegation later traced back to a concerned citizen email account linked to a domain used frequently by neighborhood association, groups affiliated with Karen's circle. It was not a court case, but its consequences could still be profound. Disciplinary action, job reclassification, formal notices that could shadow her professionally for years. Dana Lowell, her attorney, walked beside her into the conference room where 3 reviewers sat. 2 men and a woman, all stone-faced but attentive. The air inside was still. The session began. Dana spoke first with a clear, assertive tone that didn't chase sympathy. She laid out the foundation: Maria's clean professional record, her established expertise, her role as both mother and citizen. Then she addressed the complaint itself, not by defending it point by point, but by dismantling its context. She presented the timeline of escalation, a detailed account of Maria's exclusion from public space, the fabricated behavioral referral on her son, and the creation of an informal group under the pretense of school wellness that had no official authority but wielded enormous social pressure. She spoke of the campaign, not with that word exactly, but in essence, designed to isolate, discredit, and destabilize Maria in her community and career. Maria watched the reviewers closely. She noted their expressions as Dana pulled out the cease and desist exchange, the Parks Department correspondence, and the acknowledgement from the city ombudsman confirming that multiple complaints from a small number of citizens were being investigated for possible misuse. There was a moment when the woman on the panel leaned slightly forward, brows furrowed. Not skepticism, but recognition. That was the first sign. The atmosphere shifted again when Maria took the stand herself. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She spoke with even cadence, explaining how her son had been affected, not just by one incident, but by the ripple effect of social exclusion that followed. She described the exhaustion of documenting everything, of trying to keep her professional world intact while being systematically pushed out of her personal one. "I am not here to relive the day someone touched my son's wheelchair," she said. "I am here because since that day, I have been treated not as a mother defending her child, but as a disruption that needs to be quietly managed." She paused long enough for the silence to do its job. Then she continued, explaining how each institutional step, letters, whispers, assignments, contributed to a scaffolding of isolation, and how that isolation had real consequences. "They didn't just try to discredit me," she said. "They tried to separate me from my role as a mother, from my community, from my profession, without ever once saying my name aloud in public. That's how people do this now. They erase you indirectly, in policy language and social caution." When she finished, Dana submitted the final exhibits, a small stack of printed screenshots from a now-deleted neighborhood forum thread where Karen's alias had commented on the Magnolia Park incident using near-verbatim language from the ethics complaint. It wasn't proof of authorship in a legal sense, but it was unmistakable in context. The panel asked a few formal questions, then ended the session with the standard phrase, "You will be notified of our findings in writing." Maria thanked them and left the room with Dana, saying nothing until they stepped outside into the wind. 3 days passed. Then the letter arrived. The board had dismissed the complaint in full. There would be no disciplinary action, no internal audit, no mark against her professional standing. But more than that, the final paragraph acknowledged a concerning pattern of extrajudicial reputation management occurring through unofficial community structures. It was vague in wording, but it confirmed that what she had experienced was now part of the official record. It wasn't just gone. It had been documented. Maria stood at her kitchen counter, letter in hand, while Lucas sat in the next room, quietly flipping through a bird encyclopedia. She didn't call anyone. She didn't post. She just stared at the page, feeling not triumph, but something deeper, relief laced with validation. This wasn't over. Karen still held influence. The social terrain wouldn't magically restore itself overnight. But this was a break in the current, a real, tangible shift. And then something unexpected happened. That evening, her front doorbell rang. She opened it to find a woman standing there, someone she vaguely recognized from the school parking lot. The woman looked nervous, holding an envelope. "I don't mean to intrude," she said. "I just wanted you to know I was part of that parent group, the one Karen organized. I stayed quiet. I didn't know what it would turn into. But after what you said at the PTA, and after the letter came through the school, I just wanted to give you this." She handed Maria the envelope and walked away. Inside were meeting notes, Karen's notes, typed summaries of conversations, lists of concerns, references to specific parents, including Maria. Some were about school policy, but others veered into personal commentary. "Unstable," one line read, "can escalate. Watch her interactions." Maria scanned the pages, feeling a mix of shock and vindication. It was ugly, yes, but it was proof, and it hadn't come from surveillance or subpoenas. It had come from someone inside who had finally felt enough discomfort to step forward. She forwarded the documents to Dana with a note. "Now we have something more." Dana replied, "This is leverage. You choose how to use it." Maria didn't know yet what she would do with the documents. She only knew that the story had changed. She was no longer trying to escape something. Now she had something that others wanted hidden. She folded the papers, returned them to their envelope, and placed it in her growing archive. For the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her feet stop shifting. There were still fights ahead, still conversations to navigate, but the narrative had cracked, and she was no longer inside someone else's version of her story. She was the one writing it now. The weeks following the dismissal of the ethics complaint passed without fanfare, as though the storm that had nearly dismantled Maria's life had decided to retreat without an apology, without ceremony, and certainly without accountability. There was no headline, no public retraction, no carefully worded statement acknowledging the harm caused. What remained was the aftermath, quiet, personal, and shaped more by what Maria chose not to do than by what she pursued. She didn't file a lawsuit, though Dana reminded her she would have grounds. She didn't demand resignations or stage any sort of grand confrontation. Instead, she made one of the most radical decisions a person in her position could make. She stayed. She remained in the community, attended school events, walked through the same park where it all began with her son beside her. Her presence was not an act of defiance, but of reclamation. Lucas returned to his usual routines, participating again in his after-school science club and resuming his weekend outings with Maria, though now they explored new places as well. Quiet reserves outside the city where they could observe birds and keep a respectful distance from people who didn't understand them. He no longer asked why they had to change parks. He no longer flinched at the memory of being touched without consent. But Maria noticed that he watched more closely now, that his eyes lingered longer on the expressions of strangers, and she understood that while his innocence had not been shattered, it had been reshaped. The envelope from the woman at the door, the one filled with Karen's notes and internal parent group documents, remained in Maria's possession. Dana had encouraged her to use it as leverage, and in the immediate sense it gave her breathing room. Karen's name no longer surfaced in administrative meetings or school communications. The informal parent group disbanded within 2 weeks of Maria receiving that evidence. No explanation was given, but the timing was unmistakable. Maria never confronted Karen directly. There was no final clash, no cathartic scene in a parking lot or courtroom. There was simply a silence where Karen's voice had once tried to dominate, a gap in influence that was slowly filled by other voices, some cautious, some curious, a few brave enough to offer quiet apologies in passing. Maria began speaking in small community panels, not as a victim, not as an activist, but as someone with lived experience navigating systems designed more for convenience than justice. She never told the full story in those settings, never named names or detailed the full extent of what had happened. Instead, she focused on the mechanics of exclusion, the subtle ways in which people were isolated through policy and perception, through vague allegations and strategic silence. She spoke about the difference between discomfort and danger, about how institutions often confuse the two, and about what it meant to remain visible even when others wanted to turn you into a problem to be quietly resolved. These talks were sparsely attended at first, often filled with more staff than civilians, but she didn't mind. Each time she spoke, she watched one or two people sit straighter, make eye contact, nod at moments they didn't expect to feel seen. That was enough. At home, she and Lucas created a new routine, Saturday breakfasts followed by an observation hour, where they would visit a chosen spot and each write down 3 things they noticed, no matter how small. Sometimes it was the way a branch bent beneath the weight of a bird. Sometimes it was the pause in someone's footsteps. Sometimes it was the quiet look of another parent who seemed afraid to say the wrong thing and ended up saying nothing at all. Maria taught Lucas to notice everything, not with suspicion, but with presence. She believed that awareness was its own kind of safety, one that no policy could grant and no neighbor could strip away. There were still moments, sharp, unexpected, that reminded Maria how close she had come to being erased. An invitation not sent. A parent who changed direction in the hallway. A child's look of confusion when Lucas was introduced. But those moments no longer unmoored her. They were simply echoes. And over time, even the echoes faded. Karen remained in the community, though her influence waned. Her name no longer appeared in committee proposals, and the few who had followed her closely began to distance themselves, not through outrage or revelation, but through the slow, inevitable shift that comes when power no longer rewards proximity. Maria sometimes saw her in the background at drop-offs in the grocery aisles, but they never spoke again. The woman who had once tried to dismantle Maria's place in the world had become a passing figure, someone whose control depended entirely on the compliance of others, and whose silence now betrayed the absence of that control. On the 1-year anniversary of the day at the park, Maria and Lucas returned, not in protest, not in defiance, but in continuity. They sat on a bench overlooking the same stretch of lake. Lucas pulled out his notebook and pointed toward the trees where a new nest had formed. "They came back," he said without any particular meaning. Maria smiled and said, "So did we." She didn't need to win anything anymore. She had something better, permanence, and no one was going to move her again.